And we've put this session together with our friends from Nerdio, really because during our MSP-Ignite peer groups, every group, there's always conversation about either working with Azure directly or working with Azure and Nerdio. And I'm watching peer group members go back and forth with Q&A, answering questions themselves. And we've had such a strong relationship with Nerdio that we worked out this arrangement to bring a bunch of people from Nerdio together to run a roundtable discussion, a Q&A discussion. So for those of you that are on, we certainly don't want to get lost too much in the technical weeds, but we do want to have an interactive discussion on Nerdio, how to make it work for you, what it can do for you, Azure. And I think we're going to close with a nice offering from Nerdio. Am I right there? All right. So we have to be on at the end for that, don't we?
Yep. Limited time only.
It is a limited time. We're getting down to the end of that offer. So I am going to go ahead and turn this session over to Nerdio. So I'll be on the chat. I'll be pushing you guys from behind, but we are fortunate enough to have, as I said, several people here from Nerdio. But to lead us off, we've got founder and CEO Vadim Vladimirskiy with us. And Vadim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sounds good, Steve. Well, thanks for having us, and welcome everybody, and good afternoon or morning to you, wherever you're joining from. As Steve mentioned, my name is Vadim. I'm the founder and CEO of Nerdio, and today I'm joined by several of our team members. I have Natasha Boyko on with us, Garrison, Strickland, Ominsky, and Tony Kai from the Nerdio team, and we're really looking forward to having a really nice interactive discussion with you about anything and everything Windows Virtual Desktop, Azure, Nerdio, and how what questions you have and how we can help you build a successful Azure practice with Windows Virtual Desktop. So I guess by way of introduction, I'm not sure how familiar everyone who is on this webinar or this call is with Nerdio. So just give you a very quick background as to how we started. We've been around virtual desktops for a very long time. Actually, before starting Nerdio in 2016, I built an MSP that focused on delivering hosted virtual desktops. Obviously not in Azure, because that didn't exist for a while. So it was based on the private cloud and the VMware stack. And really built an MSP practice for several years, actually a little bit over 10 years. And realized that a lot of the technology we created was valuable for other MSPs who may want to build a similar virtual desktop practice. So we launched Nerdio in 2016 with the goal of helping other MSPs use our technology to build a virtual desktop practice in the cloud, and Azure was the cloud that we selected as the platform. And the rest is sort of history. Azure has certainly taken off since then. Pretty significantly. So we're happy with the platform choice that we made when we started Nerdio. At the time when Nerdio was launched, the virtual desktop technology was really limited to RDS, remote desktop services. That was obviously for all of you who are familiar, just a set of Windows roles and services that run on Windows VM. So it was an IaaS, or an infrastructure as a service solution, that our software helped deploy, manage, and optimize in the Azure cloud on top of virtual machines. And a couple of years after starting Nerdio, we started working with Microsoft, who were at that time working on building this new technology. Initially, it was called RDMI, or Remote Desktop Modern Infrastructure, and eventually was renamed to WVD, or Windows Virtual Desktop. And we were working very closely with them as they were designing this service, and made sure that it's also built into our product, which at the time was called Nerdio for Azure. And we had both an RDS deployment model, and then eventually when WVD launched in 2019, in September, I believe end of September, beginning of October, is when GA of WVD was announced. We released that functionality in the Nerdio for Azure product, making it available to our partners who wanted to, deploy WVD in addition to or instead of RDS. The nice thing that happened, I think, around that time in the world of IT and cloud is that WVD has probably been one of the most rapidly adopted Azure services, or maybe Microsoft Cloud services in general. It's been something that was of a huge interest to a lot of enterprise customers, a lot of SMB customers, a lot of service providers. It's something that's been growing very rapidly over the past year and a half since GA. For those of you who are familiar, there's been multiple versions of WVD. There's something called WVD Classic. There's now something called WVD ARM, which is available through the Azure portal. Prior to that, it used to be all PowerShell based. So in today's call, I'm hoping to just answer any and all questions, talk at any level of either business level or technical detail about WVD. We've so far, across our 3 WVD products, have seen several thousand deployments, so probably 3,000, 2,000 to 3,000 deployments across many different environments. So there's probably very little that we have not seen when it comes to Windows Virtual Desktop. And we're happy to be here and kind of share some of that experience and answer any of the questions you may have. So with that, I'll open the floor for anyone who is brave enough to turn on their camera and ask anything that it is you wanted to know about WVD or Azure or Nerdio. Okay.
I have a question. What is for an MSP, if we were to use this for our clients, what's a typical deployment look like? What are clients using this for?
So Bob, first of all, thank you for being the first to ask the question. Steve, I think Bob definitely deserves that prize that you were talking about.
Yeah, I already posted for the first 5 people. Bob jumped in, I think, before he saw it, so that's even better.
Excellent. Excellent. Bob, so if I understood your question correctly, you're sort of asking what's sort of the use case for a virtual desktop for a typical SMB company? What is it that they typically would use it for? Yeah. I'll give you my perspective, and then I'll ask maybe Tony or Will or Garrison to jump in with anything they're seeing, because they're dealing with MSPs and customers every day, all day long. So there's some very obvious use cases for Windows Virtual Desktop, and those have to do with environments where there's a line of business application that is a client server app, right? So the easiest example we're probably all familiar with is QuickBooks Desktop. If you have customers that want to run the desktop version of QuickBooks and don't want to go to QuickBooks Online, which is obviously browser-based, then you have to worry about supporting some sort of a client server infrastructure, a server in the office or a server in data center or somewhere. There's got to be a central way to host that QuickBooks database file for multiple users to connect to it through their QuickBooks desktop application. And there could be lots of examples, Sage software, other accounting packages, any SQL or Access-based legacy applications that a customer may have. So anything that's client server, I would say, is the most obvious use case for Windows Virtual Desktop, where you want to take a less than modern or legacy app and you want to make it cloud-based, right? Cloudified, whatever word you want to use. You want to put it in the cloud. You want to give the users the ability to not have any infrastructure in their office, but still have the ability to run this application in a modern way through a browser or through a client using any end user device. So that would be one obvious use case. And then I'll defer to Tony, Will, and Garrison to provide any other common use cases that you guys see.
Yeah, I think to piggyback off of Vadim's comment about the hosting line of business applications remotely, we see a lot of partners coming to that end of life for on-prem office equipment, right? So the customer is saying, well, I've heard of this cloud thing. How do I get my stuff and move it off premise? And on top of that, you have this whole remote work thing going on. So everybody's going to want to kind of work remotely. So how do you offer a customer the same desktop experience they're used to having inside of an office, perhaps maybe on their iPad or on their home machine, right? So those are some of the other use cases we see with Nerdio.
I will throw another one in there, unless Garrison, were you gonna jump in?
Well, I was going to say more and more I'm seeing medical-based companies that are concerned with HIPAA that have been work from home, and some of those have been work from home for a long time. They're looking for some kind of solution where they can centralize control of that data so that they can ensure that they're meeting HIPAA compliance. So that's definitely an opportunity to look for.
The one I wanted to add in is around BYOD, sort of policies that a lot of companies are looking to implement. So if you think about a typical organization, in the past, they used to provide corporate-owned devices, maybe buy laptops for their users. And now they're trying to get away from that and maybe provide an allowance and allow users to bring their own equipment and access their corporate data, right? And even if they're only accessing SaaS software, they still want to have some level of control of how that data is being accessed. And implementing a BYOD policy within an organization is very challenging without a virtual desktop, because you can't really control what type of devices it is. First of all, it's not always an operating system you can control. Some people like Mac, some people like mobile devices, some people like Windows. And then the way that device is configured, where it's being used, is super flexible, which is great for the employee, but very challenging for the company to really have any control of. So introducing a virtual desktop as that virtual corporate device that can be used in a consistent way, where you can enforce certain policies and do certain level of monitoring, allows companies.
You're muted there.
Sorry, someone muted me. Allows customers to implement BYOD without too much pain, right? So you give the best of both worlds. You give the users what they want. They can use their own devices, and you get that level of control that you may need as an organization that has compliance requirements. So that's another common use case.
So is
Can I
there?
ask,
Yeah,
Sorry.
can I ask, what's the standard operating procedure for hosting the FS Logix profiles? Are you using disks attached to servers, or are you using Azure file shares?
Great question. And I think that was that Chris? Yeah. Okay. So whoever asked that, I think it was Chris, because I saw that the little microphone flashing. I'll be happy to answer that. Just give me 1 second. Let me check with Bob. Bob, did that answer your question about use case? Is that?
Yeah, it did. Absolutely. I have a different question, but we can go after Chris.
Great. Okay. So Chris, and I apologize if there wasn't Chris who asked the question, so whoever asked the question. But the way FS Logix is stored can be really done in 2, possibly 3 ways. One is Azure Files Premium. The other one is a file server with an attached disk, also recommended to be premium SSD. And then for very large deployments, may not be relevant for this context, would be Azure NetApp Files. There's a certain level, a minimum there. It's pretty expensive, but that scales to thousands and thousands of users very easily. So let's talk about the first 2. So Azure Files Premium, for those of you who are familiar, is the Azure sort of hosted file server that's provided as a PaaS service rather than as a VM. And it's nice because it's very simple to configure. There really isn't anything to manage. And the way you control the cost and the performance of Azure Files is by setting what's called quota or provisioned quota. So even if you're consuming very little capacity on an Azure file share, by setting a higher quota, you're then going to be paying more because you're charged based on quota, not on consumption. And you get more IOPS and throughput, which FS Logix can really benefit from. It's the one thing in desktop environments, is the most important thing that relies on heavy disk IO. So the performance of the storage system that's hosting FS Logix needs to be very performant. So FS Logix is Azure Files is a simple to deploy, easy to manage, and fairly cost-effective way to deploy FS Logix. It's priced, and I think, Tony, jump in if I'm wrong, but I think it's about 14 or 15 cents per gigabyte of capacity, right? Not used capacity, but reserved capacity. So it's pretty inexpensive, and you start with 100 gigabytes. So really, if you think about it, it's only $14 investment. The other option is a file server with an attached disk, right? So in that case, you have a bit of a higher cost to start out with because you have a VM, and that VM generally, will be at least a 2-core, in most cases 4 cores, because VMs in Azure, the size of the VM determines how much disk IO it can push, regardless of the type of disk that's attached to it. So even if you have a very big and powerful and fast disk attached to a very small VM, the constraint is going to be the VM. So you're always starting with a very minimum 2, but most likely 4-core VM for a typical deployment. So that's already maybe a couple $100 or so for that VM. And then you can attach disks to it, which is where your FSLogix would be stored. And those disks come kind of in discrete sizes. So, 100 gigs, 256, 512, a terabyte, etc. So you can't really go a gigabyte at a time. It's more of a commitment. Those can be very performant as well. So you can get, you can get a good level of performance, maybe even better in some cases with a file server. The drawback may be that there is management involved. It's an operating system, it's a VM. There isn't that built-in redundancy that you have with the PaaS service that Microsoft provides. So it's something that you're going to need to manage, which is both a positive and a negative. You have more control on how to configure it, but then it's also your responsibility to manage that file server. So what we're typically seeing is in very small environments that are starting out, Azure Files is probably the rule rather than the exception. That's the easiest way to get started. But in environments that already have a file server for some reason, maybe you already have file shares, or you already have an application like QuickBooks that needs a database manager to run on the VM and have the data attached to the VM where the database manager is running. I'm sorry, have the disk attached to the VM where the database manager is running, then extending it for FSLogix is kind of an easy thing. You just grow your disk, you create a file share, you point FSLogix to it, and you're ready to go. So I don't know if I answered your question specifically. I'm happy to get into more details, but those are the two popular options. And I've mentioned some of the pros and cons of each.
So I'd like to ask about for the Azure Files, you have to have Active Directory domain services. And I haven't deployed that. And are there caveats to that? Is it easy to remove in case you don't want it? Or can you walk me through setting up that ADDS?
Sure. So sometimes the terminology gets a little confusing with the way Microsoft refers to this. So there is ADDS, which is Active Directory Domain Services, which is a Windows service. That's what we're all calling Active Directory. That's the role on a Windows machine, whether physical or virtual, that enables Active Directory. That's what's known as ADDS. Then there is something called Azure ADDS, so AADDS, right? Lots of letters there that are repeating themselves. That is an Azure service that provides you Active Directory as a service in Azure. Azure Files today works with both types of Active Directories, both ADDS, which is a service or a feature or a role, I should say more precisely, on a Windows machine, Windows Server machine, or with Azure ADDS. In the past, it worked only with Azure ADDS. So when you're asking, are you referring to the PaaS version of Active Directory called Azure ADDS, or are you asking about Active Directory in general?
Well, when you try to set the permissions on the Azure file share, it says, do you want to integrate with Azure Active Directory? And you click on it, and then it says you don't have those services available. And so then it tries to walk you through the process of adding whatever it is you need to get the RBAC permissions on that share.
So that is Azure ADDS. To enable Azure ADDS integration in the Azure portal is just a click of a button. You set it from no to yes, assuming you already have that in your environment, which now I understand where your question is coming from. But it's also possible to integrate Azure files with traditional Active Directory. Azure ADDS is not the only option. The only difference is it's not a UI click. You actually have to run a script and go through like a process to set it up and integrate the two. In Nerdio Manager for MSP, for example, our latest product, we automate it for you, so you don't have to do anything in terms of running scripts or logging into your domain. But if you're doing it natively in the Azure portal, you can integrate with Azure ADDS if you have it, or you can integrate with Active Directory if it's accessible from your Azure environment. So assuming you're obviously replicating your identity, you're doing AD Connect, Azure AD Connect sync to Azure AD, and your Active Directory domain controller is accessible in your Azure environment. In that case, you can integrate Azure files into your existing Active Directory. If you choose to go with Azure ADDS, it starts at about $125 or $100 some dollars. For kind of the smallest version of it, which handles lots and lots of objects, so probably not anything you'll need to upgrade. And it can be removed in the future. It sits on top of Azure AD. It doesn't sit next to your Active Directory. So imagine you have Active Directory that's syncing to Azure AD. If you were to enable Azure ADDS, that would then sync from Azure AD into its own instance of Azure ADDS. So I think your original question is, if you enable it, you set it up, can you easily remove it? Yes, you can easily remove it if that's not something you want to use. But my point is, you don't have to use it to begin with. You probably are better off integrating Azure files with your existing Active Directory.
Vadim, we have some hands raised and a chat question. So you got a few out there.
Sounds good.
Vadim, we can go to the chat first because that one's been in there for a little bit. So Andrea is asking, why would someone pick WVD over remote desktop session hosts?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Okay, so let's talk about what WVD is, right? So WVD is really a set of 4 technologies. So number one, it is a new operating system that is called Windows 10 multi-session. So it's the desktop OS kernel that is enabled for multi-session use, which in the world of RDS was only possible with a Windows server using the RDS role that would enable the multi-user kind of capability. So that's difference number one. The operating system is different, which has its own ramifications. Applications that are written for Windows 10 but not for the server OS will work on the Windows 10 multi-session, but maybe not on the Windows Server 2016 or 2019. So that's component number one, and potentially advantage number one of WVD, depending on your applications and those differences between the operating systems. The second thing is, it used to be FSLogix, so I'm gonna quickly mention it and move past it, but FSLogix is now part of RDS as well. So it's no longer a distinguishing feature. FSLogix used to be exclusive to WVD, and in RDS, there was a different profile technology called UPD or user profile disks that was inferior, but they've since made the FSLogix available as part of the RDS license. So let's put that aside. The third difference is licensing. Okay, that's really a pretty big one, and I think one of the main reasons Microsoft is putting so much behind WVD is the fact that WVD is really a free service that is part of the Windows 10 subscription entitlement. So if you're subscribed to Windows 10 Enterprise, either through a standalone SKU, like through a CSP program, you can buy Windows 10 Enterprise E3, E5, different versions of Windows 10. As long as you have a subscription license to Windows 10, WVD is free, meaning it's part of that license, Whereas RDS is a completely independent server, cal, SKU, whatever you want to call it. It's a separate product that you have to license separately. So what does that mean? So if your customer uses M365 Business Premium, for example, which is a $20 list price SKU, that includes Windows 10 subscription, which means WVD comes with it. However, if you wanted to have that same customer use RDS, you would still have to purchase an RDS cal or an RDS subscription, which would be another $6 or so per user per month, if done through the RDS software, through the CSP software subscription program. So that's one piece of the licensing, is that it's part of the Windows subscription. So for anyone who owns M365 packages, it's already built in, whereas with RDS, you have to buy a separate license. And then finally, the WVD and RDS, any virtual desktop environment, has several components to it. There is the client, right? So it's the software, the application that run on the end user's device, right? That's the same for any virtual desktop environment. There is the, let's call it the session host, or the RDS host that's delivering the user sessions. And then there is everything in between, right? So you have the client and you have the session host, and the client somehow needs to be able to connect to that session host. And those are called infrastructure services. There are things like the RD gateway, the connection broker, the licensing server, the diagnostic service, all the things that are sort of running in the background, figuring out how to take a user session and land it on the proper session host. In an RDS world are separate roles that would generally run on their own VMs, increasing your cost because you would need to host those yourself. So the cost would be higher from a VM consumption basis, but also would be higher because you now have to manage them, right? They're just managed services that you would have to manage like anything else. With WVD, all of that is packaged together into a Microsoft managed platform as a service offering, which again comes for free with the Windows 10 enterprise subscription. So you have to do nothing in terms of infrastructure services. The only thing you have to manage are the client devices and the session host VMs. And Microsoft does all of the stuff in between that gets an end user's connection and lands them on the proper session host. Does that help with explaining what the difference may be and why you would use WVD versus RDS?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I hadn't realized that there's so many costs that just add up for RDS.
They do. Now, it's not to say that there isn't any scenario where RDS may be cost effective. You know, it's possible to think of a scenario when the user doesn't need Windows 10, they're not subscribing to they don't need the Windows 10 multi-session OS as their desktop. They're not subscribing to M365, and they would have to buy their Windows license anyway. And they may already have a server running in Azure where they can just install these WVD roles. It's possible to come up with a scenario where RDS may be as or even more cost effective, but that's uncommon. It's usually WVD ends up being more cost effective for all of the reasons that I've mentioned.
I'd like to add as well that there's a lot more investments being made in the WVD platform than in RDS. So for example, there are certain things that just don't work well in RDS, which does work very well inside of WVD. And some of that is the optimizations that Microsoft has built in and around the Microsoft Office product and with Teams and Zoom. So there's a much bigger community out there that are big fans of WVD. They're always constantly innovating WVD over what we saw in the last 15 years with RDS. So Microsoft's definitely putting the time and effort in the newer product than the old one.
Awesome. And I think we've got a question from Michael McFarland, and then Brian, we'll get to you next. I know your hand's been raised for a little while now.
Mute. I've just recently introduced to Nerdio for MSP versus Nerdio, and I just want to talk quickly about the difference and why I would pick one over the other.
Garrison, Tony, Will, you want me to take it, or you want to take that?
I'd love to hear your answer.
All right, I will take it then. Okay, so the way is, so the two products, just to kind of bring everyone up to speed. So we have a product called Nerdio for Azure. We refer to it as NFA, so apologies for all the acronyms. So NFA, Nerdio for Azure, is an Azure automation product that has WVD capabilities built into it. And then we have a new product that launched at NerdioCon, which is a conference we held earlier this year at the end of January, called Nerdio Manager for MSP, and acronym is NMM. Okay, so I'll refer to it as Nerdio Manager versus NFA, Nerdio for Azure. So I think, Michael, what you're asking is, when would you choose one over the other? So our vision for the two products is they're really meant to serve two different types of MSPs or two different types of use cases. NFA is designed to be very turnkey, templatized, and as a result, less flexible. So when you go into NFA, it provisions the entire Azure environment from you start to finish, everything from networking and resource groups and backups and Active Directory and Azure AD synchronization and all the WVD components. Everything comes out of the box as part of sort of a template that we've designed, and it's very automated and very templatized, which is great if you're starting out with a greenfield deployment, but may not be ideal if you already have an existing environment and you're trying to figure out how to integrate that and manage it with Nerdio. Nerdio Manager for MSP was designed more for partners that want to manage WVD and related services in a deeper, flexible way, but may have existing Azure footprints and are comfortable managing the identity piece themselves. So for example, Nerdio Manager for MSP plugs into Active Directory and joins machines to it and does all of that, but it does zero Active Directory management. It doesn't provision it. It doesn't manage users in Active Directory. It only sits in Azure, managing Azure AD and related services, right? So if you want a very simple, turnkey, templatized thing for a greenfield deployment, NFA may be a better choice. If you have an existing WVD environment that you want to use auto scaling and image management and you want to plug something into it very easily, then Nerdio Manager for MSP is the right choice in that case. So I would say that would be the primary distinction at the high level. There's several other things in Nerdio Manager for MSP that are different architecturally. Nerdio Manager for MSP is an Azure application that actually is installed in your own MSP Azure tenant. And then from there, you can connect into your customer environments and manage them. What that means, it's not a SaaS platform. It's not something Nerdio hosts. It is something that you host. It's just an application we create. We publish it to the Azure Marketplace. You go into your Azure environment, install that application into your environment, into your Azure tenant, and from there you can manage your customers. So there are certain PaaS services that it consumes. There's an app service, a SQL database, Azure automation, and those services have some Azure costs associated with them because they're consumption components that you will be paying for to your CSP provider or Microsoft. Nerdio for Azure, in contrast, is a SaaS multi-tenant management platform that Nerdio hosts in our own environment. So you have nothing to install in your environment. You just log in, you connect to your customer's environment, and then you can start managing it without putting anything else into your own Azure environment. So those would be two distinctions. If Tony, Will, or Garrison want to jump in with any other distinctions, or if you have any follow-up questions to that, I'd be happy to answer those too.
I'll jump in. I think specifically when you're thinking about Nerdio Manager for MSP as well, as Azure adoption and WVD adoption increases, you're going to come across more potential opportunities where they're already in Azure, and the Nerdio Manager for MSP product lays on top of that very well, which Vadim kind of pointed out and spoke to a little bit. But I think that that's really important to keep in mind as you're looking for new opportunities and coming across those over the next 6 to 12 months and longer, you're going to come across more and more opportunities that come in that aren't greenfield and that may not be a good fit for that. And so the Nerdio Manager for MSP product lays on top of those existing services very well. It might let you, for example, take someone who's currently using RDS but wants to go to WVD and leverage the Nerdio tool to make that happen.
Quick question just to follow up on that. You know, I understand. So your contrast, it makes perfect sense to me. So I appreciate that. Is there any metrics right now around some of the consumption cost I should expect so I could work that into my price point whenever we sell this solution?
I was going to take that. Yeah, so it's a really great question and important. So one of the things that we've built into our cost estimator for Nerdio Manager for MSPs, it allows you to take a look at what your costs will be, not just for your customer, but also for your self-hosting of the platform. And that's built in right there. Most people, they start at a kind of a lower level in terms of the resources they're consuming, and it's roughly about $125, $130 a month to host the platform in your subscription. And then that will connect to multiple end customers. So you're not having to do that each and every single time. That will support many customers.
Okay. Was that costing you? You said 130?
Yeah, I'd say around roughly 130. Each region's maybe a little bit different. So there's some fluctuation in that. And we can always get on a call with you and kind of show you what that looks like as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Let's hop over to Brian. I know I've seen your hand icon raised for a while. It's good to see you also, Brian. So feel free to fire away.
Thank you. I'm very patient. I do have 4 questions. They should be quick to answer though. What about a situation where a client has an existing Azure VM infrastructure and you want to manage that using Nerdio? Is that something you can easily integrate with?
Yes. Yeah, the answer is Nerdio Manager for MSP will plug into that environment. It will let you link the resource groups and networks where your existing resources are and let you manage them. So even if you don't necessarily have desktops, we have server management functionality for things like auto scaling. We have role-based access controls that you can, control which of your technicians or salespeople have access to which client's environment. So even outside of desktops, there is a lot of functionality you can use to manage your existing IaaS deployments with Nerdio Manager. So Nerdio Manager definitely would be the right choice to integrate into an existing environment.
Okay, and I assume that would also help us get a better understanding of how we can fine-tune the costs with that environment.
It can help you with things like auto scaling.
Yeah.
It could also help you look at the cost estimator. So as Will mentioned, we have a tool built in called Cost Estimator, where you can go in and you can sort of model out what different configurations would look like and what those costs would be if you do reservations, if you do software subscriptions for the Windows license, if you do backup, if you do auto scaling. All of that stuff is in the cost estimator that can help you model that out. And then you can execute and action all of that with the auto scale capabilities built into both the servers and the desktops module in the Nerdio Manager.
Okay. Yeah, we're getting into the co-managed space more and more, and I anticipate getting clients that are going to have existing infrastructure. And we have another tool that we use where we kind of analyze their Office 365 licensing and understand where we can see some savings there. So I'm looking at Nerdio as a potential management tool to help us manage that. How do you work with co-managed clients? Say there's an internal IT department that also wants access to this tool. Is that something that you support?
Absolutely, absolutely. So in the Nerdio Manager, we have a role-based access model. So again, from an architecture perspective, imagine your tenant, it's running this application in your tenant. That application creates service principals into all of your various clients' environments. So you have 20 clients. all of them are visible inside of your Nerdio Manager for MSP portal. There are several roles that you can add into your Nerdio Manager portal. For example, if you're in a co-managed scenario, we have a role called Account IT Admin, and you basically invite the user who's going to be the IT admin, which is your customer's user, the IT manager, with the account admin role. You choose which account they are the admin of, and when they go to your management portal, instead of seeing a list of all of your customer accounts, they're only seeing their own account that they can manage. There's also other levels. So for example, if they have a help desk, if they have kind of tier 1 support people, you can give them limited access as well. You can give them various levels of access to just their account. And then your own technicians and your own engineers can manage that at the same time. So it's really designed for a co-managed scenario as well as a fully managed scenario.
All right, third question. I'm keeping to my 4 questions, even though more are popping in my head. I know there's other people waiting in line, but I'll get back in line. In a co-managed situation, we tend to be a lot more transparent with the tools we're using for obvious reasons. And typically we like working with channel-only vendors. How does the situation work where we've got a co-managed client? We're wanting to bring them in under our Nerdio MSP subscription model, but they're going direct to your site and entertaining the idea of signing up direct. Do you have deal registration? Do I have the ability to offer incentives or capabilities that they wouldn't get if under my MSP plan versus going direct? Can you talk about that?
I can. Great question. So we do not sell direct. Nerdio MSP product is not available to anybody but an MSP. Our Nerdio for Azure product is not available to anybody but an MSP. We do have an enterprise product called Nerdio Manager for WVD, but there's $1,000 a month minimum. So if your customer is big enough to spend $1,000 on that product, they could in theory buy it from us directly. But those 2 products are designed for MSPs and are sold only through MSPs. So we do have deal registration. So it's yes to everything you asked, but we don't sell that product directly to end users.
Okay. And then last question, in the case we get some co-managed clients, that have regulatory compliance to deal with, where we're dealing with BAAs or concern about access to PII data and who can get to what, I understand you've got the role-based access that we can manage. What about Nerdio's staff or employees? Do you have some back-end service accounts where there might be concern? I'm just thinking like willful misconduct, right? Internal employee gains access to something they shouldn't be. What kind of security layers do you have in place for that situation?
And another great one, Brian. So the product architecture is really designed with that specific situation in mind. So as I mentioned earlier, it's your own instance, and you can or give us access or any other external entity if you wanted to or not. The way that process is controlled, we have a users and roles module where you go in and you can actually add users who can access your product and select the role and the scope that they can access with. And you can specify time limits. So for example, you can add somebody whose access never expires, or you can add users whose access expires in 30 minutes or in 24 hours, and that's fully controlled by you. So if you have a client that needs a BAA, they wouldn't need a BAA from us because we should not have access into your environment.
Thank you.
All right. Brian, you snuck in there with 4 questions and not 1, so we're going to throw you to the back of the line now. I think we've got Tony up there has had his hand raised for a little while, so over to you, Tony.
Yeah, hey, thanks. So I actually work for one of those accounting ERP companies. And, we're trying to figure out where we place our bets. Do we place our bets with continuing to develop out our browser-based option? Or is the future of business software going to be sort of a client server on WVD? I'm interested you know, it seems with Microsoft's intensive investments here, they're kind of placing their bets. But what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, it's obviously a very, my answer is going to be speculatory, right? Nobody really knows, but I would say a client server based access with a WVD or similar sort of front end to enable it is likely a phase, but it's likely a very long phase, right? I think, you know, if you look 20 years from now, which in the world of technology is an eternity, I would imagine it won't look like that. I'm not sure what it will look like. It may be browser based, it may be some other technology that comes online. But I think if I look out 5 years from now, I'm still seeing in that vision lots and lots of client server applications that are being enabled and cloudified through a WVD type solution. So, you know, depending on which company, Tony, you work with, I guess it depends. You know, a lot of times you have the SaaS or the browser-based product that obviously the development started many years after the client server-based version, which is considered the more robust and the more functional one. And at some point they may intersect. And maybe at that point, it's going to start tipping. So that's just my personal opinion. Obviously, very speculatory. I have no idea what it's going to be, but I think it's a phase, but it's a long phase to how software is going to be delivered. You know, many years.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Awesome. And I know we've got some questions in the chat, but I'm going to jump over to Luis because I've seen your hand raised for a little while as well.
Sure, it's actually Lewis. So we recently installed software on a client's template and pushed it out. And there were some registry edits that needed to be made for pathing in the HKey local user. Once we pushed it out, realized that it only took effect for the admin. How do you make changes like that on the host so that everybody gets the same end result?
Let me answer it like this. So the HKey current user registry branch, whatever the right term is actually stored in a file called ntuser.dat in each user's profile folder, right? So unlike the HKey local machine, which is stored in the Windows System 32 folder, this is a per user thing. So what you're seeing is expected behavior. If you have a per user customization or application versus a per machine one, the user that you use to make that change is going to be the only one who will capture those changes. So again, that's expected behavior. It's not anything that's broken in the environment. To answer your question about how do you ensure that everyone gets the same settings, it really depends on what those settings are. Typically, things like group policy or scripted actions or things that can run in the user context are necessary to set up user-specific settings, because you really can't do that until the user logs in, because that's the only time that HKey current user registry gets loaded into the OS. Until then, it's just a file sitting somewhere inside of some profile on storage. So I think the short answer is, depending on what those settings are, there should be group policy controls for it. If it's vendor specific, they may have their own ADMX or ADM files that can control those settings. If they're simple registry things, then you can easily script it either with group policy or with the logon script that will apply upon user logon. Now, the nice thing is with any per user settings is once you make them once, they persist even if you keep re-imaging your desktop image, because re-imaging doesn't impact the user registry because the user registry is part of a profile and the profile is persistent from machine to machine. Louis, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome. Sorry, I'm slacking on my Vanna White duties here, passing the questions around. I think, David, we had a question in the chat from you, but I see you there on camera. So if you want to ask that live, you are more than welcome to. Oh, you're muted there. There we go.
Hi, the question was on a line of business application, how do we go about finding out if the client's line of business applications are compatible with WVD? That's kind of one of the things I'm kind of skeptical about, because here's the situation. I have a client is, they're still on-prem. They have SQL Server, and they run their line of business application on their desktops and access the database. So I'm not sure how to find out how their line of business, or how does it become compatible with WVD, or how do we find that out?
Good question. I think, maybe if I were to rephrase it a little bit, it's not so much whether it's compatible with WVD, it's maybe more of whether the application is multi-session compatible, meaning can you install the application on a single VM and have multiple users running it concurrently on the same machine? I would say that's the biggest question to answer, because if the answer to that is yes, then there's 90% plus certainty it will work in WVD, it will work in RDS, it will work in any other virtual desktop environment where you are sharing the same session host across multiple users at the same time. So it's a multi-session question. How would you find out? I mean, you can obviously look around or ask people that may have had experience with this exact application. I would say that's the quickest shortcut to find out if it's even worth the effort. But ultimately testing it in a small lab environment and seeing, if I have, if I create 3 test users and I log into this application, does it still work when it's being accessed concurrently by multiple users? If not, if let's say you discovered it is just, this application, it runs off of the C drive, it doesn't respect that unique user data must be stored in the user profile, and it writes things to the C drive and it doesn't put things where they belong, that doesn't mean you can't use it. It just means you can't use it in a multi-session kind of way. And WVD has 2 modes of deploying users. You can deploy what's called pooled session host pools, or you can deploy personal host pools. Pooled host pools have a set of VMs that are sort of participating in a pool of capacity that any user can connect to, and multiple users can land on the same one at the same time. That's sort of what you think about when you're thinking WVD or RDS. It's multi-user per host without any consistency as to which host it is. However, there is also something called personal host pools, where each user gets a dedicated machine. So imagine a dedicated Windows 10 machine running in Azure that's used by only one user. If that's the case, then from an applications perspective, that's no different than the user being connected to a physical computer under their desk with a server in the closet. It's the same thing, but the VM, instead of being under the desk, it's in Azure, and the server is also in Azure. So in a personal model, applications almost always work, and I'll mention some exceptions, but almost always work. In a multi-session model, they need to be tested or verified that they will work, and maybe even checking with the vendor if there is support for that application to begin with, whether they will support it in the multi-session environment. The type of things that are generally difficult to work with in a multi-session environment are in a remote environment, regardless of multi-session or single session, are things that have very unique peripherals. So imagine if you have, a POS system that's connected to a cash drawer and a receipt printer and a fingerprint scanner, and it's got all sorts of peripheral connectivity. Probably not a good fit for WVD, because you are going to be connecting these physical devices that are here to a machine that's somewhere else. And that doesn't always work reliably. So that's scenario number 1. And scenario number 2 is if you're doing something very graphically intensive, you will need a GPU-enabled VM in Azure, which is very possible, and the cost is coming down tremendously. So it's definitely a use case that's available, but it's just something from a cost perspective you're going to need to take into account, that if it's something graphically intensive, if it's CAD or Revit or any of those applications, they will need a GPU. So the cost of that compute capacity is going to be higher.
And that GPU, is that multi-session as well?
It could be.
It could be, okay.
It could
Or
be
it could
multi
be-
or single.
Or it could be a single session. So what do you mean by single session? Is that a dedicated VM, basically? And
Yes.
that's it? Okay, all right.
So what? Think of one-to-one, user to VM, or one VM for many users.
Many
So
users.
multi-session is the latter case, and single session is the first. And
Gotcha.
I'll let Tony jump in as well. I saw he unmuted, so he has something to add. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to add that Microsoft actually has a program called Fast Track. And if your deal size is over $5,000 in monthly recurring revenue, to them, they'll assign a Fast Track engineer. And this is, their guarantee, but they're saying any application that will work with an RDS environment that will also run on a Windows 7 and or a Windows 10 machine, they'll have a very high likelihood of getting them to run inside of WVD. So they'll invest that effort into figuring it out for you if your deal size is large enough. But those are the three sort of criteria: that it works with RDS, works on Windows 7 or Windows 10. It's a high likelihood that they'll get running on a Windows WVD environment.
Okay, and one more question with according to this one is now, like you're saying, if we need to test this environment, say, I have this one, okay. I know it's always been difficult for me to test things in Azure because of cost and things like that. I'm not used to Azure. It reminds me of the stock market, where you buy all this stuff, you're buying it, but in the meantime, it's it's accumulating costs, even in testing phases or whatever. You're just trying to see how the product works and things like that. Now, when it comes to something like that, do we go to the client and say, hey, we would like to test out this application, but it will cost? How do you guys approach that to a customer? If we want to test, hey, we want to test your OST and quick bid software in this environment before we actually go full-fledged. How does that work? Or how do we deal with that to a client?
So I can jump in here on what I see from MSPs that I work with, which is very, very frequent. I think it depends on the size of the customer and what the applications are, right? Common applications, QuickBooks, ones that you can easily look up system requirements and see is RDS listed in there. Most people are not going and testing it because they're taking that and saying, okay, I know it will work in a multi-user fashion. It's the ones where the software vendors like, I don't know, we've never tested that before. In that case, I see kind of two different ways. The MSP may be running their own internal use environment, and Nerdio provides some free licenses for that. And maybe they turn it off when they're not using it, and then they turn it on when they are. So you light it up, you go and install the application like you would a customer, you can test it out. You will incur some costs for it. And for some MSPs, that's client acquisition costs. For other ones, they say, listen, I'm not going to work for free and I don't want to do this. I'll probably never encounter this application again. So they are asking their customers to maybe put some money behind it. And I've seen it also happen where, hey, put some money behind it. If it works and you move forward, we're going to credit that money back to you, right? So that way you don't get stuck working for free, and there's some incentive for them to move forward kind of as a final hurdle, but not do it too early on in the process, right?
Okay. That's good. Okay.
Awesome. Lots to think about there. I will go over to
Thank you, guys.
Paul, because I see Paul on camera there. Good to see you, Paul, as well.
Hello. So I think my question is kind of a something similar to what David asked before. We have a prospect that I met with yesterday. They have some estimating software. The estimating software requires that they have a USB token inserted into their laptop or desktop for license authentication. Short of, again, talking to the vendor and seeing how they would play in the space, do you have any knowledge on similar stuff?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. The vendor will tell you it can be done because they don't want you to be able to run it remotely, right? The reason there is an authentication token is they want to run it on that machine and that machine only. But there's really two possible ways to do it. One that always works and the one that may work or may not. So in the RDP or the WVD client, there is a way to redirect USB devices. So it may be possible, depending on what that USB dongle authenticator is, it may just natively be able to redirect it into your WVD session and pick it up, right? So that's sort of the easy thing to try. No equipment needed. It may work, but it may not. I think it's a 50-50 depending on the type of hardware it is. The other option is to get what's called a USB server device. I haven't personally done this in a couple of years, but there was a company called Silex that used to have a USB to network devices. Basically, it's a tiny box. You plug it into your network. It's like a print server, but it's for USB devices. So you will plug it into that USB server. It plugs into the network. On the WVD server side, you're going to install a driver that's going to be able to discover and talk to that USB server via the network. You'll need a site-to-site VPN for that, right? Because it's going to be a machine talking to this device over a private network. And then once it discovers it, it will emulate the USB as if it's plugged into the physical machine. And in that case, it will work because the application will just see it as a regular raw USB device, even though it's being transferred over the network over site-to-site VPN. The next thing to test would be the multi-session capability, meaning if you have the application running in a multi-session environment, you're using a USB server device that's connecting to the authenticator, whether it will work for multiple users at the same time. There is the technical capability question, but probably more importantly, there's the licensing compliance question, because probably the reason they're using the authenticator is somewhere in the license agreement. They have something about not using it in a multiplexed way, and this will enable you to do that. So just be careful to make sure that the customer doesn't run afoul of any licensing requirements for that type of software.
Great, thanks.
Awesome. So I've seen that Jim has had his hand raised on the participant list. I don't think you're on camera, Jim, but if you want to ask your question, fire away.
Yeah, how is bandwidth allocated? If I've got 5 or 6 VMs and then I suddenly add another 50 people, is bandwidth automatically allocated? It seems like I'm seeing some bottlenecks, especially with Outlook and multiple people sending files at the same time in our current WVD environment.
So bandwidth out of and into Azure is a dynamic thing, meaning there isn't any throttling by default on bandwidth. Depending on the size of the VM, the amount of throughput may be limited, but probably not to anything that would affect Outlook or file, email sending. So if you're adding more users and they demand more bandwidth because there's just more of them sending more things in and out of Azure, you should not need to do anything. It's a completely dynamic thing. Microsoft will just allow you to send more, and for any egress, any outbound connectivity, you will obviously be paying, a few cents per gigabyte of transfer data as bandwidth consumption. So that should be a fairly dynamic thing. The bandwidth between the office where the users are and the Azure data center makes a difference, because even though users, so the communication between Azure and the client's office, let's say where the users are, is all the desktop streaming traffic. It's the keyboard shortcuts and mouse movements that go one direction, out from the customer office into Azure. And then there is the desktop streaming, the screens that go back. That can get sizable, depending on how many users there are. There are some calculators. Tony, if you have a way of referencing some in the chat, that would be great. But there's some calculators that can tell you, depending on the type of usage it is, how much bandwidth egress is going to be sent from my virtual desktop to whatever the client device is. So if you have an office of 1,000 people and they have a 10 megabit connection, you're going to be constrained because all the desktop screens are not able to be transferred within such a small pipe for so many users. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So we are going to, let's see, where are we going to jump now? We're going to go to Eric up here on camera with zebras. And then we are going to get to Clint, who I see posted a couple of questions in the chat box. So Eric, take it away.
Awesome, thanks. So I guess, what are people using for thin clients as opposed to computers to connect to the WVD environment? I mean, especially for video passing through with Teams, because I know I have some demo units here from 10Zig, and the Linux ones didn't pass the video and audio back for Teams.
Tony, Will, Garrison.
Okay, sorry that. Yeah, hey. Yeah, so there's obviously many different client vendors out there. I would say the hardware itself is not as important as the software it runs. So it sounds like you got a 10Zig Linux operating system. So one of the big Achilles heels with the Linux thin clients nowadays, with whether you get it from 10Zig or iGel or NComputing, they're all limited by the fact that the WVD Linux SDK for these thin clients don't support camera redirection. Right, so which is forcing these players to kind of invent their own solutions. So I know like NComputing, which is really a device that looks like this. You can see, but it's a tiny like thin client that's the size of like a credit card. But this guy can actually do thin client or video redirection, but it doesn't take advantage of the WVD optimization for WVD. So there are Linux thin clients that support the redirection of camera and audio, but maybe not necessarily with the optimization for WVD that we're looking for. So if you want to play it safe, get a Windows based thin client or Windows 10 IoT thin client. Dell makes them, HP makes them, 10Zig, iGel, they all make them. It's just really 100% based on the operating system and not really around the hardware itself.
Got it. So I'm pretty much limited to the Windows 10 IoT devices.
Right, but one of the benefits of a 10Zig is that you can actually reflash that firmware and use that same hardware to install a ISO of a Windows 10 IoT on it. So.
And I would speculate and say it's a time limited restriction. I think as things evolve, the Linux SDK that Microsoft has for WVD, I'm sure will eventually catch up. Now Windows 1 will always be ahead because it's their own product, but all of this functionality will eventually come to Linux. The question is when.
Thanks.
Awesome. Clint, I see you jumped on camera there. So do you want to ask? I think the second question may have already been answered, but the first question you've got is a great one. So fire away.
Is there a WVD pre-workshop questionnaire one may use to ask the right questions to customers before starting a new WVD deployment?
Yeah, we have a questionnaire. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Will.
Yeah, we do.
Go ahead.
Yep, we do have a questionnaire. We can provide it after this, I guess. As a follow-up, we also, if you go to our website, getnerdio.com, there's a section where it lists virtual events. One of the virtual events is how to price out Azure. And it's actually a 1-hour session or class that we run that goes through all of the different questions that you should be asking, why they're important, and where they line up with the cost calculator built into our software to make it really easy for you to go get those questions answered, fill out the pricing, and be done and have a complete Azure environment or bundle built out within just a couple of minutes. So we can definitely make that available to you, Clint.
Thank you. And the second question is, it builds up on Jim's question as well, where I would like a bandwidth analyzer or calculator I may use to determine and gauge bandwidth requirements for hybrid deployments. We usually start with a small setup, either through a POC. However, when we go into production and all the users are added to the WVD environment, we find out at a very late stage that the customer bandwidth is not enough. Is there a way to calculate or estimate how much bandwidth one customer needs on-prem for such a hybrid deployment?
I just pasted a little picture in the chat box that shows the bandwidth requirements per user, depending on the type of workload and the number of monitors that that person has. So it's a good thing to take a look at.
All right, thank you very much.
Awesome. And we're going to jump to Nagesh, who has had a hand raised for a little bit, but I did just want to jump to a quick question that Lewis had asked in the chat, which is similar when we're talking about the cost estimator. Where can we find brandable WVD marketing materials, and will a WVD calculator that will spit out a client-facing quote?
Who wants to take that?
I can take that. So let's take the client-facing quote first. So as far as I know, and Vadim can correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have anything, at least at this time, that will actually go and just spit out a client-facing quote. What we do have is the calculator that allows you to figure out your pricing. And then we also have a proposal template where you can populate whatever other services you're going to bundle and your margin and give a more of a retail price or presentation to your end customer. And it, you know, part of the reason why we don't have those plans at this time is just every MSP does things differently. They're bundling in different services. They're going for different margins, and it's kind of too hard for us to, make all those different assumptions and kind of please everybody. So we got to give you what you need from the Azure, WVD, and Nerdio side, and then let you kind of fill in the blanks with the other services and margins you're going to wrap around that. In terms of brandable WVD marketing materials, we do have some. So Lewis, I'll send you some. I have your email, so I'll send you some of that stuff. I have some presentations. I can send you the proposal template, and we have some of those other things as well. I'm not 100% sure, but I got to imagine that Microsoft maybe has some of those materials as well.
Just posted the proposal template in the chat if anybody wants to take a look and download it.
Great. Let's pop over now to Nagesh. If you've still got a question.
Yeah. Hi everyone. My question is more related to applications. More or less the desktop part. We have covered throughout the session. But then, when it comes to next-gen development, so let's say Docker for desktop, and you need do a development related work on the Docker. So on-premise solution, Citrix or VMware, because of the network bandwidth, it chokes the overall network because there is a lot of ingress and egress basically happens when you are doing a Docker kind of a development. So for Docker, for mobile emulation, these kind of next-gen development related work, which majority of the companies are investing in. So how does WVD plays a role in that, and then what kind of solution fits perfect for such kind of requirement from the customer?
Great and somewhat hard question, but let me see if I can if I can shed some light. So when you're talking about containerization and Docker and all of those things, that's generally referring to the back end, right? That is the where the application is, the data. It's the thing that's not visible to the end user. Whereas WVD is really a client side or an end user computing interface, which is not where you would be using Docker. And the way those two would interact, obviously, the Windows session would somehow connect to a Docker application, either through a browser, through a client, whatever the case may be. And that connection, when you're running both of those components in Azure, is very fast, right? So if you're running your client, sorry, my headset is dying. I'm gonna switch this real quick. So if you're running both if you're running the Docker application in Azure, but your client is on premises, then you can be constrained by the network connectivity. But if you're running it on a WVD session, since that's in Azure as well, then you have better performance. So WVD doesn't touch the back end so much. It doesn't touch the application backends. It's only the user computing, the end user computing piece that it helps run in a Windows session.
Understand, but then how exactly, do we take care of hardware acceleration? Let's say some application these days, next gen application requires hardware acceleration. And for an example, mobile emulation. Mobile development is the recent work which is getting done at majority of our customers. So just wanted to understand hardware acceleration and emulation related exercise where the application looks for some kind of, not just the virtual CPU piece of it, but then the virtual and a hardware acceleration, which is currently possible on a physical boxes, so how does that play a role here? Yeah.
I think I understand your question better. Maybe I maybe misunderstood it. I think you're asking if you are doing the mobile development or the Docker development, how does WVD enable the people doing the development, not the application when it's done, but the development process? Okay, got it. So obviously in a virtualized environment, you are going to have some limitations as far as accessing the physical hardware, unless you're using very expensive dedicated hosts to the Azure, which you could. That's really not available. But for emulation, which generally leverages GPU, there's lots of options. There is now AMD GPUs, there's NVIDIA GPUs, different size VMs that could be auto-scaled, shut on and off, depending on when they're needed. So if the emulation software, the development environments you're working in need a GPU in addition to the CPU, that's possible. And that's very commonly used right now in WVD. If it needs access to some other physical component, and I can't really think what that would be, then obviously you're going to be limited in a virtualized environment of any sort, whether it's Azure or even on premises.
Yeah, understand. Can I have an opportunity to ask one more question, if that's okay, Natasha?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I hold the power here. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So, Vadim, the next question is related to, let's say Citrix, VMware, they have been ruling this desktop virtualization market from quite some time. They traveled a long way when it comes to presentation server, and today where they stand. So what I wanted to understand is that, majority of our customers in some form and capacity, they have been invested in Citrix or VMware solution, right? So, and then
so did you say have or have not?
Have. They have.
Okay.
They have. Now, and we all know that the limitation which comes up with the on-premise hosted Citrix or VMware kind of solution. And then when majority of the market is taken over by Microsoft and WVD by default becomes the choice, then so now customers are also thinking about Nerdio, about WorkSpot, about Utopia. So these are different vendors there, and they're out in the market. So what basically happens to the physical machine, how physical on-premise solution, with Nerdio? Is there a integration? Are there any APIs which basically can talk to vCenter or VROPS and get all of that data so that we have one single unified console? Is there a possibility, and are we thinking on those lines?
So there isn't today, and sort of in the context of our discussion here with Nerdio Manager for MSP, I don't know how many SMB customers that MSPs work with really have invested in Azure and Citrix. I think maybe certainly on the enterprise side of end user computing, those guys own the market pretty much. Microsoft is the new kid on the block when it comes to desktop virtualization with WVD. So in the case of Nerdio Manager for MSP, I don't see us integrating with any on-premise environment, sort of as a roadmap or kind of a vision for the product. I don't think that's going to happen. On the Nerdio Manager for WVD, it's nothing is off the table. We have a lot of customers that are moving over to WVD from Citrix and from VMware, and there may be opportunities to help them with some optimizations, but today we don't have any integration with on-premises technologies.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. And Vadim, just a follow-up question on that. I see that no one has raised hands, so let me take an opportunity there. So when you basically mention about Citrix VMware, so when it comes to moving the workload from on-premise to cloud, so there are a lot of documentation when it comes to the other piece of it, the server side of it. When it comes to the desktop side of it, obviously there are a lot of hiccups, there are a lot of unknowns. And application, you don't play with your desktop, right? You play with your application. So how do you make sure that those applications are getting delivered to the end user is a larger and a bigger question these days. So how do you cater to those kind of argument or contention from the customers? Just wanted to understand a little more on that.
Sure. So let me address it in two ways. So number one, the key thing to remember with WVD is that multi-session operating system I mentioned at the beginning, which is one of the it's a very common way of using WVD is with the Windows 10 multi-session. If you're using Windows 10 multi-session, which can only be used in Azure as part of WVD, then by definition, the customer's current on-premises environment is not using it, right? It can't be because it didn't exist and it's not licensed to run on premises. So what that typically means is that on premises customers are running Windows Server, Windows 10, enterprise single user, and what they want to end up with is Windows 10 multi-session. So to answer your question, I'm going to avoid it. I'm going to say, well, for most people who want to take full advantage of WVD, the concept of moving desktops isn't relevant because they're rebuilding everything anyway, because their operating system is changing. Now, the question is, once you've rebuilt the foundational components, you have the operating system, how do you migrate the application? And there's lots of new technologies. We have concept of scripted actions. It could be scripted. We have MSIX App Attach, which is a new technology from Microsoft that's picking up some steam that's integrated with WVD. So there's several things that can help with that process. But in our experience, everyone who goes to WVD wants that multi-session Windows 10, which means they're rebuilding from scratch their session host VMs.
Yeah, I mean, what I basically mentioned is the master image, which is already there. But I understand from a multi-session kind of a model, you have to build it, which is understandable. But then when it comes to the single session, customers, majority of the customers will have the master images.
Those can just be cloned, right? So those things are easy to just clone, use ASR, get it into Azure, and then use it as an image. That's a pretty simple process.
Correct. Understand. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions. Okay.
Awesome. So Bob, I know you had asked a couple of questions in the chat. So we'll jump over to you so you can ask those. And then Juan, we will move up to you after.
All right. So first question, what's the client interface like for individual users? Is it through RDP or is it through like Bastion web-based stuff? How are they getting to their virtual environment?
The client interface is broadly referred to as the WVD client for obvious reasons. And it comes in multiple flavors. On Windows, there is an application that you install. It's like the RDP client app that you're used to, but it's different. It's a specific thing for WVD, and they keep updating it every month. It's going through very rapid development. So it's an app you load on your machine. You open it up and you do a subscription. First thing is you subscribe to your WVD feed, which goes through an Azure AD authentication. And that's a great thing because any multi-factor authentication or any policies that you may have applied for conditional access are going to apply. So that will allow you to enforce all of your existing Azure AD security controls. And what Tony is showing us, thank you, Tony, is what that WVD app looks like. Inside of it, depending on who you are and what's published to you as the end user, you will see different workspaces, different host pools. You will see desktops, which are the icons on the right, kind of the blue looking ones, and you'll see individual apps. As you double click on each of these, it will open up the right resource depending on what it is that you're launching. So in this case, it looks like Tony is launching a desktop, full desktop right there. So that's the Windows desktop client. The other option is called the HTML client, which is a URL you go to, again, log in with Azure AD credentials and see something like this, but inside of a web browser. And as Tony pulling that up, basically, you can run all of your apps inside of any HTML5 compatible browser on any operating system. And then each mobile OS, so think Android, Mac, iOS, Mac OS, they each have their own version of the app, which is basically similar to what it looks like on Windows. So it's a native app that's running in the OS and lets you connect to the portal and then launch your application. So that's what the end user environment looks like.
Okay. And then kind of piggybacking on that, what does the security look like for your BYOD client computers? How do you prevent copying information from a virtual machine to your desktop? That type of thing.
So there are some controls. You can enforce certain level of restrictions about printer redirection, drive redirection, copy and paste from the clipboard. All of that is available as a setting, kind of as an administrator setting at the host pool level. You can use things like Intune to enroll your BYOD devices and manage them with restrictions as well. That obviously has a license cost that comes with it, if the client is willing to pay for that or not. And any other tools, whether it's your RMM that you may be controlling the machines with. So it's a pretty traditional way of controlling the endpoint. The endpoint you control as you would control any endpoint, and then what the endpoint can transfer between the WVD session and the local desktop depends on what you've configured on the host pool level.
Okay.
And Tony is showing off the bandwidth in Azure. That's pretty good. It's almost as fast as my phone. My 5G, ultra wideband. Down the block, I get 1.8 gigabits, that is. Did that answer your questions, Bob?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Okay, I think Juan was next.
Yep, Juan. Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, I think you just might have answered the question. So we are rolling out our first client on NMM with WVD, and for most of our on-prem RDS solutions that we have now for our clients, we push security as a big thing for us in the last couple of years. So we're using basically dual RD gateway for the RDP users. So that was my question on how on the WVD, how they would do MFA. Obviously, you just figure in Azure AD conditional accesses. But
that's right.
So a little bit unclear on me on an actual RDP or raw RDP client. Was that how would it work there?
So Tony, if you can share that one more time. So there's two authentication steps. The first one is the subscription to the feed. It's called the WVD feed. And that process is an Azure AD authenticated login. So anything you enforce on your Azure AD, including conditional access, trusted networks, all of that stuff, will be respected here. It's a regular Azure AD login. So for instance, if you may have an office location where the IP is whitelisted as a trusted network and it doesn't require MFA, then when they open up their WVD client for the first time, they type in their username and password, it will not give them an MFA challenge. However, if you have a policy that says, outside of the office do provide a challenge, then when they open up their WVD client outside of the office, it will ask them for that challenge. Does that answer your question, or were you asking something different?
Yeah, well, yeah, he went in. So I get this part, but then when you click on the actual RDP, there's the RDP.
When you click on the actual resource, it no longer goes through the MFA or the Azure AD authentication. This is now Windows only authentication. So the only time you can use all of the conditional access is at the subscription stage. And you can decide, you can expire your subscriptions rapidly so that when users, let's say the next day they log in, they have to log in again. So if they're taking this laptop home, they're no longer subscribed, and now they have to go through the MFA challenge. So you have all of that flexibility in Azure AD.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony.
Cool. So I'm going to comb through some of these questions in the chat. And while I do that, Brian, I see you've got your hand raised. So if you want to fire away here.
Yeah. So one of the things that is just kind of ingrained in me, dealing with on-prem equipment is, system resource allocation. And I notice when we, determine what resources these WVDs are going to need, typically, if you were to buy a piece of hardware with those resources, I mean, it would just be chugging along and barely operating. So I'm trying to wrap my head around building confidence that when you're in a virtual environment, you don't need nearly the resources you would need with like a bare metal environment. And I don't know if you guys can speak to that to help explain the reasoning behind that.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So, if you think about a typical on-premises environment, you are optimizing for not having to replace it too soon, right? So the worst case scenario is you buy a client, a set of servers, you install them, and then 3 months later, you need to replace them because you've undersized it, right? That's the worst case scenario. You never want to be in that scenario. So that means you're always going to buy the peak capacity amount plus some. You're probably going to figure out, well, how much can they use at the maximum? And then let's double it. And that's how much we're going to buy, because the risk of underbuying with a fixed cost, kind of a CapEx expense, is really high. In the cloud, the approach is different. And the reason it's different is because you are paying for consumption, and it's very easy to go up and down kind of by clicking, right? It's not a matter of buying new equipment and reinstalling everything and investing any CapEx. You can double the size of your VM by just clicking a button, and you can shrink it by just clicking a button. So the cost of change is very little, unlike on premises, and the cost of the capacity is higher because it's consumption. So on premises, you're optimizing for not having to replace it too soon. In cloud, you're optimizing for the highest possible utilization with the best possible performance, meaning the best case scenario, the hypothetical scenario, is that all of your equipment is used 100% all the time, but the users are not complaining that it's too slow, right? It's impossible to match it that precisely, but I think you get my point. With an on-premises environment, if you look at the task manager over time and you're at under 10%, you're not going to think twice about it, because, well, if I'm way more than 10%, who said I'm not going to bump up against that ceiling and have to replace the equipment? Whereas in the cloud, if you're at 10%, you can definitively know that you are overpaying, because you're paying for 90% of your CPU capacity that you're never using. So conceptually, that's kind of where it all starts. The goal in the cloud is to match your user demand to your supply as closely as you can, because that's going to result in the best possible cost. And if you make a mistake, it's easy to adjust. So if you make it too big, you can come down. If you make it too small, you can go up. You obviously have to balance it with not giving users too much pain in the process of giving them, performance that's not good enough. So let me kind of just stop there and ask Brian, like, does that make sense conceptually, what you're optimizing for in each case?
Yeah, and I think it's easier to, when it comes to servers, especially because most of our on-prem servers are, virtual guests, and I've seen, that advantage. Where I get a little worried is more on the end user desktops. And the fact that they have, I mean, you've even got it listed here, right? Chrome, Teams, Office, that just love memory. And, we're doing a minimum 16 gigs memory now on our workstations, and sometimes even 32 if the user loves leaving way too many tabs open in Chrome. And so I'm trying to understand how your commonly used VM size, or might have 8 gigs of RAM, and what sort of ramifications we might run into from an end user experience.
Great. So I think to answer that question, we need to think about, well, what's the likely constraint in my customer's environment? And I think you just said the likely constraint is memory, because they're opening lots of stuff and leaving it running. You could also, so you could be RAM constrained, or you can be CPU constrained. We typically see people being CPU constrained, but let's talk about the scenario of RAM being constrained. So if you're RAM constrained, RAM is pretty cheap in Azure. So for instance, you can see an example here of, let's say, this D2AS-V4, for instance. You can see under the D series. That's a 2-core 8 gig of RAM machine. If you were to upgrade it to a E series machine, to go to E2AS-V4, which is 2 cores and 16 gigs of RAM, I think you would pay roughly 15% more for double the RAM. So RAM is relatively cheap. And if you know you're going to be RAM constrained, you're going to go into the E series class machines where the ratio between CPU and RAM is 1:8. The most common scenario is your CPU constraint, in which case you're likely in the D series machine where the ratio is 1:4. And then there's also the F series, which is a 1:2. So if you're not using any RAM, but you're using a ton of CPU, that's the family of VMs that you're going to want to look at. So when you have users that are RAM hungry, just think of E series. You're going to pay about 15% more for the same number of cores, but it's not a huge amount of extra cost.
Okay, and then I'm assuming the idea is to get them to do the majority of their work in the virtual environment, right? I mean, especially if you're giving them like a thin client. Okay, all right. My questions are answered. We can move on.
I think we should talk about how users stack, how multi-session users chew up the session host, right? Vadim, do you want to talk about that, and how, if you give somebody if you give somebody a 16 gig machine, if you look at their task manager, how many are they actually consuming, right? So if that number is either 8 or maybe it's 12, but it's never 100%, right? So the idea is that if you have a multi-session machine, you can take a couple of people who you're banking on that they'll never use the CPU or RAM consumption 100% of the time, and load multiple people on that machine to get their CPU usage, maybe not above 80%, but if they're somewhere hovering under 70, then you're happy, right? So when you do the math, you compare that, loading multiple users to a larger machine versus giving somebody an individual machine, that's really where the cost savings come in, right? So if you're kind of afraid, maybe you go light at first, but you'll very quickly, within the first couple of days, determine how many maximum amount of people can go into a machine without anybody complaining, right? There's a magic number. So when we do the quote estimator with you guys, we try to look at the amount of users assigned per CPU core. And if you're not 100% sure, we go power user, which means one person assigned to one CPU core. And most of the time that's overkill, but sometimes it's not. So to answer your question, you don't really truly know until you really see it in action. But that's why when I quote with partners, I always overestimate, just in case either one of us is wrong.
And just to build on top of what Tony said, so you have this consolidation effect of multiple users to the same set of resources. That's one source of savings. And the other source of savings is when you buy a physical machine, you've paid for it, you own it, it runs 24/7 or runs 12/5, you don't save any money, right? It's yours, it's there, electricity, but that's pretty minimal. In Azure, if you have an auto-scale engine that can match the machine's power state to when the user needs it, you end up saving. So let's think about a typical scenario of 40 hours per week of utilization on a 168-hour week, right? That's how many hours are in the week. So that's less than 25% of the time that the user is actually logged into their machine. So imagine if you could take your VM cost, let's say is $100, and you only use it 25% of the time. So now you're only paying $25, or only a quarter of that initial cost. Plus you can get multiple users onto that machine. So it starts to add up pretty quickly where you're saving as compared to buying people local machines.
Yes, if you have a typical user that's maybe a 40-hour work week end user, and you take that and you multiply it by 4, it's 4 weeks in a month, you're at 160 hours. having maybe 16 people on this machine, sharing the consumption of this over $161, you're looking at about $10 per user per month on the compute. So the idea here is that pay-as-you-go, or the auto scaling capability, it can even save you more money than doing a 3-year reserve when your users are using a typical machine for under 300 hours per month. Right. So at 300 hours per month, it might be cheaper to go reserve instance, because doing a reserve instance gets you down to 290. But if you're sort of your 40-hour work week type of user, you can get a machine for 161 per month.
And you don't have to make a commitment for 3 years to Microsoft. All right, I think we answered your question, Brian. So let's move on.
Yeah, so it looks like, Louis, you had a couple of additional questions in the chat box. I think you had 2 or 3 of them in there. Do you want to ask those?
Starting at the bottom, I guess, when is MSIX app attach going to be general released? And when it is, will you have to uninstall and reinstall all of the applications?
So MSIX app attach, so MSIX is a packaging format of Windows applications that is it's GA from Microsoft. It has been for a couple of years now. App attach is the ability of taking an MSIX application and, instead of installing it, attaching it without installing it. That has been GA since about a year ago. So Windows 2004, so April or May of last year. And then there is MSIX app attach WVD portal integration that just went into public preview about a month or 2 ago. That's still in public preview. So the UI to connect all the pieces together is in public preview. It's built into one of our products. It's coming into Nerdio Manager for MSP. I expect it's going to be GA in the coming weeks or months, pretty soon. But that would be the expected timing. Again, I don't know exactly what Microsoft will do. To answer your question about uninstalling applications, so MSIX is a different format, meaning you can't take an existing application that's already installed and sort of convert it to MSIX. You either have to get your application as an MSIX from the vendor who publishes it, or you have to take your existing application installer, whether it's an exe file, MSI file, whatever batch file, whatever is used to install the application, and you can use a tool called the Microsoft MSIX packaging tool to convert it into an MSIX. So the goal is to get your installer today into the MSIX format. Once it's an MSIX format, then you can use Nerdio Manager or the Azure Native Portal to attach it and make it available to your users without installing it on the VMs themselves. My expectation is that MSIX is going to take some time to ramp up. I think it's going to have a tipping point when the major vendors start releasing their apps in MSIX format. So think, Adobe and all the big app publishers. When they start releasing MSIX applications, that means you no longer have to go through your own packaging process. And that's when I think adoption is going to pick up pretty quickly. But for now, it would be a manual process. You would take your Adobe Acrobat, you would fire up the MSIX packaging tool for Microsoft, you would start capturing that Adobe Acrobat, and the end result would be an MSIX app that you can then attach to your session hosts.
Well, what are the advantages as far as the host is concerned?
The advantages are limited to the fact that you do not have to install the application on your image. So if you think about MSIX relative to the operating system, it's just like FSLogix for the user profile. So what FSLogix does is it decouples a user from a machine. MSIX similarly decouples an application from a specific machine. That means your machine can just be the operating system and maybe Office and kind of basic infrastructure level or kind of foundational core apps. But your custom apps are all MSIX that get attached when the user logs in.
So your image requires very little maintenance. If your image has 100 apps installed on it and you need to update one, you're now re-imaging all of your VMs because one app changed. In a decoupled scenario, you only change one app, you don't change the image at all. And then when the user logs in, they get the new version of the app. So it's ease of ongoing management at a very large scale that's going to get the biggest benefit from MSIX App Attach.
Okay.
And just to add to that, you know, even Microsoft Office isn't the MSIX App Attach ready yet. So it's just to give you know, Vadim some ammo there that it's going to be a while away, I think.
It's a cool technology, and I think it helps create a vision of the future of how, you know, decoupled applications and user sessions will be from the operating system. But it's not something you're going to be deploying for your clients in the next 3 months, let's say. Especially because you're not dealing with hundreds of apps in a typical scenario. You know, if you're looking at an enterprise, you can have 1,000 or 1,500 apps in an environment. In an SMB, you know, you have a dozen, half a dozen, 2 dozen, but it's not, the application sprawl isn't nearly as bad as in a very large organization.
Okay. Did you want me to ask the other questions, or?
Yeah,
Sure,
fire
go ahead.
away.
So if you prefer a domain controller with Active Directory, but you want to use NMM, Tony actually answered this for me, but I'll ask it. How do you get to that scenario?
You could build it yourself if you'd like. You can create a VM, install AD, you know, Windows AD role on it, install Azure AD Connect, and synchronize it. So just like you would with an on-premises environment, but you will do it on a VM. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is you can use NFA Core to provision that environment for you, and then layer NMM on top of it to leverage that Active Directory. So that's another sort of quick way to do it where you don't have to do anything manually.
So if you use NFA, it's going to use a VM with disks. How do you get those disks then to be Azure files?
So NFA Core, if you're familiar with that version of the product, doesn't have any desktop capabilities. It is only setting up a domain controller, not setting up a file server. It's not setting up any host pools or anything like that. It's just a DCL1 VM that has AD installed on it. And that's it. And you know, the network and everything that it needs to get to that point. But that's what the NFA Core would be about. And then when you install NMM on top, then you can provision and create new Azure file shares and things like that.
Gotcha. Okay.
Awesome. So it looks like questions have started to slow down, and we've got about 10 minutes left. So I did want to take some time. We had mentioned at the beginning of the session, and thank you all so much for sticking with us. This has been great. We've got a really awesome promotion going on right now. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes. We don't want to sell you too hard, but I did want to just let everyone know about this promotion because it's incredibly valuable. So I'll let, I guess, either Tony, Garrison, Will, do you guys want to talk about the promotion that's running until the end of the month?
Oh, was it me? So yeah, so there's a promotion going on right now where Microsoft is covering 6 months of either Nerdio for Azure or Nerdio Manager for MSP licensing. So that's unlimited seats for up to 5 customers, free licensing from Microsoft. So you can deploy this with production customers and not have to pay for the Nerdio part of it.
Let me just add a little bit more color. Hey, this is Joseph Landis here. Great session. So the promotion actually has a few components. So as Tony said, any new customer you provision, as long as you sign up for the promo by March 31st, even if you provision the customers by June 30th, you're going to get unlimited users for 6 months, which is a pretty great value, because I think most MSPs, you're going to come up with your per user per month cost, you're going to sell it to your customer, and then you're basically just going to get kind of a rebate, or you're not going to have to pay for the Nerdio licenses. The second thing that Microsoft is offering is there's another company called Block 64. Block 64 is a very cool evaluation tool that you can run on your customer environment, and it'll produce a report for you talking about any kinds of vulnerabilities, opportunities to optimize, and many other things. So you'll get a free license for that customer for Block 64. And then finally, the third piece of the promotion is the ability to get from Nerdio what we call our Go Live engineering support. So anyone who's a current partner of ours, Lewis or others, probably is familiar with our Go Live engineers, where we assign an engineer to help you to kind of virtually look over your shoulder and help you with the deployment, with getting Nerdio set up. So for your first 2 customers, we're going to give that to you as free as well, thanks to Microsoft. So great promotion. I think we've never done this with Microsoft before, and I think if you're thinking about bringing a new customer to WVD or maybe have one ready to go, now's a great time to do it. You could reach out to any one of us. You could, just send us an email. You can, I think I don't know, Natasha, maybe we'll put everybody's emails in the chat or something, or if we have a slide we could pop up there. You could reach out to any of us and we'd be very happy to get you enrolled and get you going. It's pretty easy. So that's the promotion. Good. And hey, Steve, how are you? Thank you very much for your sponsorship and partnering with MSP-Ignite. We always enjoy doing that, so it's great to be part of this today. I was taking a very backseat role today, as you can see, until the end, but we've got an amazing team here that I think put on a great session. So
they really did, Joseph, and I think it was nice that you came on just for the exciting giveaway at the end.
That's really the value that I provide in this company, so I try to do that.
Fantastic session, great timing. I don't know how Natasha managed to also make all the questions go right up until the end. There was one
my
more.
first rodeo, Steve.
Yeah, you're a pro. That's what it is. So great job. We will record this and we'll make it available to everyone that signed up. So those that couldn't make it will also get a chance to see it. We'll remind them that they want to look at it quickly since there's an offer that's expiring. And of course, we'll reach out to all of you and thank you and make sure you have all the contact info you need as well. So great job, everyone from Nerdio.
Great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you
for having us.
All right. And the questions don't end here. If you have questions, you can always reach out to us at any time. We're super happy to support you, and great session. And let's do it again.
Awesome. Thank you for hanging with us for a couple of hours today. We really appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, guys.